My name is Eleanor, but my friends call me Ellie. I'm 28, and 3 months ago, I married the love of my life, Leo. Our wedding dinner was supposed to be the happiest moment of my life. Instead, my own father, in front of all our friends and family, raised his champagne glass and, in his toast, called me a disappointment and my life choices garbage. I sat there, frozen in my wedding dress, feeling my entire world crumble. But what my parents didn't know was that the phone in my husband's pocket, the one they'd scoffed at for vibrating during dinner, had just received a text confirming a billion-dollar deal. If you're watching this from somewhere you've ever felt undervalued by your own family, drop a comment letting me know where you're viewing from. And please, hit that like and subscribe button, because the story of how one disastrous dinner became the sweetest vindication might just change how you see your own self-worth. To understand the humiliation of that night, you have to understand that I've lived my entire life in the shadow of my parents' expectations. My parents, Richard and Catherine, are cut from old cloth, the kind that believes worth is measured in bank balances and social standing. They live in a sprawling house in a wealthy suburb, where everything from the manicured lawns to the charity galas they hosted was designed to project success. My older sister, Clara, and I grew up in that world, but we were treated as if we were from two different planets. Clara, 2 years my senior, was the golden child. She was beautiful, charismatic, and most importantly, she followed the script. She studied finance at a prestigious university, interned at my father's firm, and got engaged to a corporate lawyer from an equally prominent family. She was a perfect reflection of my parents' values, and they adored her for it. Every achievement was celebrated with lavish dinners. Every mistake was gently brushed aside. I, on the other hand, was the quiet disappointment. I was artistic, a trait my parents viewed as a frivolous hobby rather than a viable career. When I won a full scholarship to a renowned art school, my father looked at the acceptance letter and said, "Well, at least we don't have to pay for it." There was no congratulations, no pride, just reluctant acceptance. I studied graphic design and I loved it. I was good at it, and my professors saw my potential. But every time I came home and showed them my projects, my mother would squint at my designs and ask, "But how will you ever make a living with this, Eleanor?" The differential treatment didn't stop at careers. It was woven into every aspect of our lives. When Clara's car broke down at college, my father drove 3 hours to bring her a new one. When my beat-up sedan finally died, my dad sent me a link to the local bus schedule and said, "This is a good opportunity for you to learn some self-reliance." I worked 2 part-time jobs all through college just to cover my living expenses, while Clara received a generous monthly allowance to focus on her studies. After graduation, I started freelancing, building my client list slowly but surely. I wasn't rich, but I was proud of my work. I lived in a small but cozy apartment that I decorated myself. Clara, meanwhile, was handed a vice president position at my father's company, a role everyone knew she wasn't qualified for. My parents bought her a penthouse condo downtown as a welcome to the real-world gift. I grew accustomed to being the second-class citizen in my own family. I learned to stop seeking their approval, focusing instead on building a life that made me happy. And then, I met Leo. We met at a local coffee shop where I was sketching a logo for a client, and he was coding on his laptop. He was a software developer, a quiet genius with a passion for creating something new. He didn't care about money or status. He cared about innovation. He saw the value in my work, in my creative soul, in a way my parents never had. With Leo, I felt seen. When I introduced Leo to my parents, it was a predictable disaster. They saw a young man in jeans and a t-shirt who talked about algorithms and user interfaces with an excitement they couldn't comprehend. He didn't work for a major corporation. He was building his own startup out of our apartment with 2 friends. To my parents, this translated to unemployed and unambitious. "A computer programmer?" my mother said later, her voice dripping with disdain. "Eleanor, you can do better. You're selling yourself short." They never understood. They never tried. To them, Leo was just another symbol of my poor life choices. They treated him with a cold civility, always asking condescending questions about how his little project was coming along. They had no idea he was working 18-hour days, pouring his blood, sweat, and tears into something he believed could change the way we interact with technology. They just saw someone who didn't fit their mold of success. Despite their disapproval, we fell deeply in love. 2 years later, Leo proposed. He couldn't afford a huge diamond, so he designed a ring himself, a simple silver band with a small moonstone, my favorite gem. It was more beautiful and meaningful than any diamond could ever be. When I joyfully told my parents, my mother's response was, "Oh, well, I suppose you don't need an expensive ring when you don't have much to show for it." The comment was a dagger, but I was determined not to let their negativity spoil our happiness. We decided on a small, intimate wedding, an outdoor ceremony at a beautiful local botanical garden, followed by a dinner at a restaurant we loved. It was perfectly us, and most importantly, it was within our budget. My parents were horrified. They had envisioned a massive affair at the country club, a chance to impress their friends. When I politely refused their offer to help, which was really an attempt to take over completely, they became cold and distant. They told me if I insisted on having a budget wedding, then I shouldn't expect them to contribute a dime. We had never asked them to. I thought I could handle their judgment. I thought that on my wedding day, they would set aside their disappointment and simply be happy for me. I thought my love for Leo and the joy of the day would be a shield against their silent criticism. I walked down the aisle, believing this was a new beginning. Completely unaware, I was walking toward the most humiliating moment of my entire life. Our wedding day began like a dream. The sky was a perfect, cloudless blue, and the botanical garden was bursting with the vibrant colors of autumn. I wore a simple, elegant gown I'd found at a vintage shop, and Leo, in his tailored suit, looked breathtakingly handsome. As we exchanged our vows under an arch of fiery red maple trees, surrounded by our closest friends and the few family members who genuinely cared, I felt a pure, unadulterated joy. For the first time, my life felt whole. My parents were there, of course. They couldn't miss the optics of not showing up. My mother wore a dress in a bland, off-white color, a choice I knew was a deliberate jab. My father spent most of the time before the ceremony on his phone, an annoyed expression fixed on his face. During the ceremony itself, they sat in the front row, their faces rigid. They didn't shed a tear. They didn't smile. They simply observed, like critics at a performance they didn't want to attend. My sister, Clara, and her fiancé, Richard, were there too. Clara looked bored, constantly glancing at her Apple Watch. Richard, whom I found insufferably smug, clapped Leo on the shoulder and said, "Good luck, mate. You're gonna need it," with a smirk he thought was charming. It was a small interaction, but it set the tone for the rest of the day. My family wasn't there to celebrate. They were there to judge. The true catalyst for the coming storm wasn't a single event, but the wedding itself, an occasion that should have been about love and unity, but which, for my family, became a stage to perform their contempt. It was like putting an open flame in a room full of gas. An explosion was inevitable. The great event, the catalyst, was our refusal to follow their script. We had chosen love over money. We had chosen authenticity over appearances. And to my parents, that was the ultimate betrayal of everything they stood for. Their initial reaction was clear from the moment they arrived. When my mother saw the venue, she said, "Oh, it's quaint." The word quaint uttered as if it were a profanity. My father commented on the small size of the event. "I suppose you don't have many important friends to invite." Every word was a tiny pinprick, designed to deflate my bubble of happiness. Leo, sensing my tension, took my hand and whispered, "Ignore them. Today is about us." And I tried. I really did. I smiled for the photos. I laughed with my friends. I had my first dance with my husband, held in his arms, feeling safe and loved. In that moment, I almost forgot they were there, watching from their table with critical eyes. After the ceremony, we moved to the restaurant for the reception dinner. It was a cozy, elegant space with exposed brick walls and sparkling string lights. It was where we'd had our third date, the place where we realized we were falling in love. It was meaningful to us. To my family, it wasn't big enough, not grand enough. I overheard Clara whisper to my mother, "I can't believe they chose this place. It looks so cheap." The shift in the atmosphere was palpable. The joy and intimacy of the ceremony began to dissolve under the weight of my family's judgment. They sat together at one large table, barely speaking to the other guests, creating an island of ice in the warmth of the room. I could see our other guests noticing. My Aunt Agnes, my mother's sister, and a kind woman who had always treated me with warmth, came up to me with a worried expression. "Don't you let them ruin your day, Ellie dear," she whispered, squeezing my hand. "You deserve all the happiness in the world." Leo saw it too. He kept checking in on me, his eyes asking, "Are you okay?" I would nod and force a smile, but it was starting to feel strained. I felt like I was walking a tightrope. On one side was the joy and love I felt with my husband and friends. On the other was the deep chasm of my family's disapproval, and I was trying desperately to keep my balance. Our wedding, the catalyst for everything that was to come, forced everyone's true colors to the surface. It showed the unwavering support of our real friends and my Aunt Agnes. It showed Leo's deep love and protectiveness, and it stripped away my parents' and sisters' thin veneer of civility, exposing the cold, hard contempt underneath. The storm had been building for years, but our wedding was what finally brought it to shore. I just didn't realize how devastating the landfall would be. As the dinner service began, the small pinpricks started to turn into more overt stabs. The escalation was swift and cruel, a series of calculated incidents designed to unbalance me and remind me of my place in the family hierarchy. The first incident happened right after we were seated. Clara was passing a bottle of red wine across the table, and as it reached me, she accidentally fumbled it. Dark red wine splashed across the pristine white bodice of my wedding dress. "Oh my gosh!" she gasped, her shock sounding painfully rehearsed. "I'm so clumsy. I am so sorry, Ellie." The table fell silent. The deep burgundy stain spread across the satin, an ugly scar on a symbol of purity. My mother rushed over with a napkin and began dabbing uselessly at the stain, clucking, "Clara, how could you be so careless?" But the look she gave me said something else entirely. It said, "See? You can't even have nice things on your wedding day." Leo was instantly on his feet, offering me his suit jacket to cover the stain. "It's okay, my love," he whispered in my ear. "It's just a dress. Don't let it ruin our night." But the damage was done. Every time I looked down, I saw that red stain, a physical reminder of my family's toxic presence. Next came the comments about the food. We had chosen a menu we loved. Sophisticated, family-style comfort food made with locally sourced ingredients. It was delicious and hearty. When the servers brought out the main course, my father looked down at his plate with theatrical disgust. "What is this?" he asked, loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "Fried chicken? At a wedding? Richard, are we at a church picnic?" Richard, Clara's fiancé, let out a booming laugh. "At least it matches the venue," he said, winking at my father. They were turning my wedding into a punchline, and I was the joke. I tried to ignore them, focusing on the conversation with my friends, who were raving about the food and the atmosphere. But it was hard to tune out the constant hum of negativity radiating from the head table. The third incident was even more personal. My mother struck up a conversation with the wife of one of my father's business partners, who was seated at our table. "Oh, it's just wonderful to see Ellie finally settled," my mother said in a sickly sweet voice. "We were worried for a while. When you have one child who is such an achiever, like our Clara, you always fret about the other one, you know. The more free-spirited one." She said the words free-spirited as if they were synonymous with irresponsible. But Leo is a lovely boy, she continued, patting my husband's arm condescendingly. Even if his little business venture doesn't work out, I'm sure he'll find something. IT work at a school, perhaps. The condescension was breathtaking. She was not only demeaning me, but my husband as well, dismissing his years of tireless work as a failed hobby. Leo's hand tightened on mine under the table. I could feel his anger, but he stayed silent for my sake. He knew causing a scene would only make things worse, but I could see the hurt in his eyes, and that stung more than any insult directed at me. Throughout the meal, the pattern continued. Clara bragged about her lavish wedding plans, talking about European venues and couture designers, every word an implicit comparison to my humble event. My father loudly discussed a major business deal he'd just closed, then turned to Leo and asked, "So, what are you doing to keep busy these days, son?" I felt myself shrinking. The energy and joy I'd felt at the ceremony were completely gone, replaced by a heavy sense of resignation. I tried to talk to my mother privately. Catching her near the restrooms, I said gently, "Mom, I know this isn't the wedding you wanted, but it means the world to Leo and me. I would really appreciate it if you could just try to be happy for me." She looked at me, her face a cold mask. "Eleanor, don't be so sensitive. We're just making conversation. If you can't handle a few harmless jokes, perhaps you're not mature enough to be married." Gaslighting. It was her signature weapon. Turning their cruelty into my fault, my oversensitivity. I walked away feeling utterly defeated. There was no getting through to them. They didn't listen. They didn't care. The final piece of outside validation came from my Aunt Agnes. She found me standing alone on the small balcony, trying to get some air. "Ellie," she said softly, draping a shawl over my shoulders. "I've been watching them all night, and I want you to know, it is not okay. The way they are treating you is not a reflection of your worth. It's a reflection of their own insecurities." She went on, "I've seen this your whole life. They picked Clara, and they never gave you a fair shot. But you have built a wonderful life for yourself in spite of them. You've found a good man who loves you for exactly who you are. Don't let them take that from you. Don't let them convince you that you are less than." The tears I'd been fighting all night began to fall. Hearing someone else confirm what I'd always felt in my gut was a painful, validating release. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't being too sensitive. I was being mistreated. "What do I do?" I sobbed. "Tonight," she said. "You just survive it. You hold your husband's hand, and you know that you are loved. But after tonight, you have to make some hard decisions about the place these people have in your life. You cannot keep letting them treat you like this. It will destroy you." Her words gave me strength. I wiped my tears, thanked her, and went back into the reception room, feeling a renewed sense of resolve. I wouldn't let them ruin this night. I would focus on Leo, on our friends, and on the love that had brought us all here. But the escalation wasn't over. The final, most brutal unmasking was yet to come. It would arrive during my father's wedding toast, a moment meant for honor and blessing, which he would instead use as his ultimate weapon of public humiliation. I thought I was prepared for anything. I was wrong. The time for speeches arrived. Leo's best man, Mark, gave a funny, heartfelt toast, recounting stories of their friendship and how happy he was to see Leo find me. "My maid of honor, Sarah," cried as she spoke of our 20-year friendship and how proud she was of the woman I'd become. The room was filled with warmth and love. And then my father stood up. He took his champagne flute and tapped it with a fork. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to him. He stood there, tall and imposing in his expensive suit, a picture of patriarchal success. "I'd like to say a few words," he began, his voice booming through the space. He smiled, but it never reached his eyes. "As many of you know, I am a man who believes in tradition. I believe in legacy. I believe in building something that lasts and passing it on to the next generation." He paused, looking around the room as if gathering agreement. "Catherine and I have worked very hard to give our daughters the best. We gave them a great education, opportunities, and a solid foundation from which to build successful lives. He turned to look at Clara, who was beaming. And with Clara, we succeeded. She embraced those opportunities. She is building an impressive career. She's engaged to a fine young man, and she is carrying on the family legacy we built. We could not be prouder. The room applauded politely. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I knew what was coming. This wasn't a speech about me. This was a speech about Clara, with me as a regrettable footnote. Then he turned to me. The smile vanished, replaced by a look of grave, almost pitying seriousness. And then there is Eleanor, he said, his tone shifting. Our youngest, the artist. He said the word artist as if it were a disease. Ellie has always marched to the beat of her own drum, he continued. While we tried to teach her the importance of stability and financial security, she chose to follow her passions. The pause was theatrical. She chose a different path. A path with no map, no safety net, a path, frankly, that is unlikely to lead to the kind of success our family values. I could feel everyone's eyes on me. I tried to keep my face neutral, but I could feel my cheeks burning. Leo gripped my hand under the table, his knuckles white, and then my father delivered the final blow. We had hoped she would outgrow these things, he said, his voice now cold and hard. We had hoped she would realize that living in a tiny apartment and working on little projects is not a life. But instead, she has doubled down on mediocrity. She has chosen a partner who shares her delusions. He shot a contemptuous glance at Leo. I look out here tonight, he said, raising his glass, and I see on one side a legacy, Clara and Richard, the future of our family, and on the other side I see something else. He looked directly at me, his eyes devoid of any warmth, any love, only cold disappointment. They say one man's garbage is another man's treasure. I suppose the same is true for life choices. So I raise my glass to my daughter, Eleanor, and her new husband. May you one day find the treasure in the garbage you've chosen to build your life upon. A dead silence fell over the room. Garbage. The word hung in the air, toxic and indelible. My father had just called my life, my love, my very being, garbage in front of everyone I cared about. The humiliation was absolute, public, and searing. I felt as if the air had been sucked out of my lungs. I saw the shocked faces of my friends. I saw my Aunt Agnes staring at my father in disgust. I saw Clara and Richard trying desperately not to look smug. That was the breaking point. In that single moment, something inside of me shattered. The thin thread of hope I had clung to for years that one day they would see me, that they would love me for who I was snapped. All the years of being dismissed, ignored, compared, all of it coalesced into that one devastating moment. I wasn't their daughter in their eyes. I was a mistake, a disappointment, garbage. And as my father sat down, pleased with the destruction he had just wrought, I knew that my Aunt Agnes was right. I could not go on like this. Something had to change. This relationship, as it stood, was over. I just didn't know that the change would come much, much sooner and more spectacularly than I ever could have imagined. The very second my father sat down, leaving an awkward, pained silence to hang over the room, another sound cut through the tension. A low, persistent vibration from Leo's jacket pocket. It was almost inaudible, but in the dead quiet, it sounded like an alarm. My father glared across the table. "Unbelievable," he muttered, just loud enough for us to hear. "Can't even turn off his phone at his own wedding. The disrespect." My mother shook her head in theatrical disgust. Leo ignored them. His face, which had been a mask of fury on my behalf, suddenly changed. He pulled out his phone. The screen lit up with a text notification. He read it, then read it again. A look of utter disbelief washed over his face, quickly replaced by a slow, spreading grin. It wasn't just a happy grin, it was triumphant. He looked up, his eyes locking with mine, and in that instant, the rest of the room melted away. He didn't have to say a word. I could see it in his eyes. It had happened. After 3 years of relentless work, sleepless nights, and sacrifice, his little project had finally come through. Our secret weapon had never been a plan for revenge. It was simply the truth of Leo's work. A truth my family had been too arrogant and short-sighted to ever see. Leo's startup, Nexus AI, wasn't a hobby. It was a revolutionary artificial intelligence platform designed to streamline complex data analysis for scientific research. For the past 6 months, he and his team had been in deep, secret negotiations with a massive tech conglomerate, Innovate Corp, for an acquisition. The talks had been intense and confidential. Leo had signed a strict, non-disclosure agreement, meaning he couldn't even tell me the specific details. All I knew was that it was huge, and it was in the final stages. We had been living in limbo for weeks, checking emails and waiting for the call that would change everything. We decided not to postpone the wedding, determined not to put our lives on hold for a business deal. My family, of course, knew none of this. They had never asked real questions about his work. They had never shown genuine curiosity. They had simply dismissed it as a pipe dream. Their arrogance had been their blindfold. And now, in my darkest moment, the light broke through. Leo leaned over to me and whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. They signed. The deal is closed. The wire transfer just came through. Ellie, we did it. I looked at him, trying to absorb the full weight of his words. The sting from my father's speech was still fresh, but a new, powerful feeling was beginning to rise up. A sense of empowerment. The plan for the reversal formed in my mind almost instantly. It wasn't premeditated. It was born of righteous anger and a sudden, stunning clarity. I was not going to sit here and take their humiliation for one more second. I stood up. My legs were a little shaky, but I stood tall. Leo stood with me, his hand on the small of my back for support. The room fell silent again, everyone watching us, unsure of what was happening. "Dad," I said, my voice surprisingly clear and steady. "I appreciate your well wishes." The sarcasm was thick. My father narrowed his eyes at me. "Sit down, Eleanor. Don't make this worse." "Oh no," I said, a cool smile playing on my lips. "I think things are about to get a whole lot better, for us at least." I turned to all of our guests, who were watching with a mixture of horror and fascination. "I want to thank all of you for being here tonight to share in our special day. It means the world to us." I paused, then turned back to my parents and sister. "It has also been very illuminating." As my father so eloquently pointed out, my husband, Leo, and I have chosen a different path. We chose to build something of our own, from the ground up. We chose to invest in our ideas and our passions, even when those around us saw them as delusions. I looked my father straight in the eye. "You've always taught us the importance of building a legacy. Well, tonight, Leo and I have started to build ours." I turned to Leo. "Honey, would you like to share the good news?" Leo stepped forward. He was no longer the quiet, unassuming guy they had always dismissed. He stood with a new confidence, bolstered by years of hard work finally paying off. "Yes," he said, his voice strong and clear. "For the past 3 years, my team and I have been developing a software platform. Ellie's parents have referred to it as my little project. Others have called it a long shot." He paused, letting the tension build. Well, 5 minutes ago, that long shot paid off. I'm pleased to announce that our startup, Nexus AI, has officially been acquired by Innovate Corp. A few murmurs went through the room from people in the tech industry who knew who Innovate Corp was. My father scoffed. "Innovate Corp? Sold it for a few $1,000s, did you? Enough to cover rent for a couple of months?" Leo smiled. "Not exactly." He looked at me, then back at my father, and he said the words that would change everything. The acquisition deal, which was just signed and funded, was for $1.2 billion. The silence that fell over the room was so heavy it felt physical. It wasn't the awkward silence that had followed my father's speech. This was the silence of absolute, shattering shock. $1.2 billion. The number seemed to hang in the air, surreal and absurd. I watched my parents' faces. My father's jaw was slightly agape. His smugness evaporated, replaced by a blank look of disbelief. The color drained from my mother's face, leaving her looking pale and gaunt under the restaurant lights. Clara and Richard were staring at each other, their eyes wide. It was Richard who broke the silence. "You're kidding," he said, but it sounded more like an accusation than a question. "Nobody pays that kind of money for some unknown startup." "Apparently, Innovate Corp disagrees," Leo replied calmly, holding up his phone. "I have the confirmation email from their CEO and the wire transfer notification from our bank right here. I'd be happy to forward it to you if you'd like to see." The reality of it hit them. It was undeniable. My father's face went through a rapid series of emotions. Shock, disbelief, envy, and finally, something that looked like panic. He had built his entire identity on being the most successful, most powerful man in the room. In a single moment, the son-in-law he had just publicly ridiculed had become exponentially wealthier than he was. But this wasn't about the money. It was never about the money. It was about respect. I stepped forward, a cold calm settling over me. "You were right about one thing, Dad," I said. "You talked about legacy. And you've spent your life building a legacy based on money, status, and appearances. You taught us that a person's worth is determined by the school they attend, the job they have, and the money they make." I glanced at Clara, who was now avoiding my gaze. "You succeeded with one daughter. She is the perfect product of that legacy." Then I looked back at my parents. "But with me, you failed." Because I learned a different lesson. I learned that worth comes from kindness. It comes from integrity. It comes from treating people with respect, no matter how much money they have in the bank. It comes from loving someone for who they are, not what they can do for you. Those are lessons you and Mom never taught me. I had to learn them on my own. "Eleanor, this is not the time," my mother began, her voice trembling. "This is exactly the time," I interrupted, my own voice finally rising with all the pent-up hurt and anger. "For years, I have stayed silent. I have taken your criticism, your constant comparisons, your lack of affection. I told myself that was just your way of showing you cared. But tonight, you showed me the truth. You don't care. You're just ashamed. You're ashamed I didn't become Clara. You're ashamed I married a man you deemed beneath me. And Dad," I said, my voice shaking but firm, "you felt entitled to stand up in front of all our friends and call my life, my home, my love garbage." Tears began to stream down my face, but they were tears of rage, not sadness. "Do you have any idea what that feels like? To be publicly humiliated by your own father on your wedding day?" My father was speechless. He just stared at me, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. And then my mother did what she always did. She tried to do damage control. She stood up and came toward me, her face fixed in a wobbly, fake smile. "Ellie, darling, your father didn't mean it. He was just joking. He's had a little too much champagne. Richard, tell her you didn't mean it." My father remained silent. "Oh, I don't think it was a joke, Mom," I said, taking a step back. I think for the first time my father was being completely honest about how he feels. And you know what? I thank him for it. Because his honesty has finally set me free. I turned to Leo, who stood steadfastly by my side. "Leo and I are leaving now." "What?" Clara gasped. "It's your own wedding. You can't leave." "Why not?" I asked. "We said our vows. We signed the papers. We're married. The rest is just a party. And frankly, I'm no longer in the mood to celebrate with people who just called my life garbage." I turned to our guests. "Again, thank you all for coming. Please, stay. Enjoy the food and drinks. The bill has been taken care of." I looked directly at my father. "By us." It was a small jab, but it hit its mark. My father had insisted on paying for the dinner. It was his one concession to the wedding as a way of asserting his power. Me taking that away from him was a final assertion of our independence. As we started for the door, my father finally found his voice. "Eleanor, get back here," he commanded. I paused but didn't turn around. His voice changed, losing its authority, replaced with an almost imperceptible note of desperation. "We can talk about this. About this young man's deal. Perhaps there are investment opportunities, to keep it in the family." The audacity of it was breathtaking. In the span of minutes, he had gone from calling us garbage to trying to get a piece of our success. I turned back, giving him one last look. "No, Dad. Not anymore. This family, by your definition, is over. From now on, Leo and I will decide who our family island." Leo took my hand, and we walked out of the restaurant together, leaving behind a stunned silence and the wreckage of a family that had been broken for a long time. The cool night air hit my face, and as the door shut behind us, cutting off the drama inside, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. We had walked out of the shadow and into the light of our new life. The first feeling as we walked out of the restaurant, leaving our own wedding reception behind, wasn't sadness or regret. It was pure, absolute freedom. It was as if a physical weight I had carried my entire life had finally been lifted from my shoulders. The night air was cool, and the smell of rain on the hot pavement smelled like a new beginning. I was still in my wedding dress, now with Leo's suit jacket draped over my shoulders. The red wine stain was still there, but it didn't bother me anymore. It was no longer a symbol of humiliation. It was a battle scar, a reminder of the fight we had just won. Leo and I didn't speak for the first few minutes. We just walked, hand in hand, through the quiet city streets. Finally, I stopped under a streetlight and turned to him. "What did we just do?" I asked, a laugh that was half disbelief, half relief escaping my lips. He smiled, that brilliant grin back on his face. "We just started our life, Ellie," he said, "on our own terms." He pulled me into his arms, and I buried my face in his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. I felt safe. For the first time, I felt completely, unequivocally, safe. We didn't go back to the hotel where we'd booked our wedding suite. It felt tainted by the evening's drama. Instead, Leo called a car, and we went back to our little apartment, the place my parents had scorned, but which, to us, was a sanctuary. Stepping inside, it had never felt more like home. We shed our wedding attire. I carefully hung up my dress, stain and all, and changed into an old t-shirt and sweatpants. Leo ordered pizza, our signature celebration food. We sat on the living room floor, surrounded by stacks of books and design sketches, eating straight from the box and drinking cheap champagne out of coffee mugs. It was the most perfect wedding reception I could have imagined. Over the next few hours, our phones started buzzing. My Aunt Agnes called to say how proud she was of us. Our friends texted to check in and tell us we did the right thing. The party, they said, had dissolved quickly after we left. My parents and sister had departed almost immediately, in stony, embarrassed silence. My phone was also flooded with missed calls and texts from my father, mother, and Clara. I didn't read them. I simply turned my phone off. Tonight, their world couldn't touch me. Our new dawn began the very next morning. Life had changed overnight, but at the same time, it was the same. We were still Ellie and Leo. We woke up in the same apartment, but now there was a new silence, a new peace. The constant, low-grade anxiety of trying to please my family was gone. The initial fate of my family came to us through Aunt Agnes a few days later. She said their small, tight-knit community was buzzing. The story of my father's speech and our dramatic exit had spread like wildfire. For the first time in their lives, my family's perfect facade had cracked, and people had seen the ugliness underneath. My father, a man obsessed with his image, was facing quiet criticism and judgmental looks at the country club. My mother had canceled her weekly luncheon. They were publicly embarrassed, not by us, but by their own actions. Meanwhile, Leo and I started making plans. The money was staggering, and we knew we had an immense responsibility to use it wisely. Our first step was meeting with financial advisors and lawyers to get everything set up properly. Our second, and more important step for me, was finding a new place to live. Not because we didn't love our apartment, but because we deserved a space we could truly call our own, untainted by the ghosts of judgment. We found a beautiful loft in the city's arts district, with massive windows overlooking the skyline and a perfect open space for a design studio for me and an office for Leo. It wasn't a suburban mansion. It was us. As we packed up our old apartment, I found a box of old photos. Inside were pictures of me as a little girl, crayon drawings, my first attempts at art. I smiled. That little girl had always been there, the artist my parents tried to extinguish. That night, I hadn't just stood up for myself and my husband. I had stood up for her, too. And that was true freedom. 1 year to the day after our wedding, as I stood on the balcony of our loft, a warm coffee mug in my hands, watching the city wake up, I felt a profound sense of peace that I once thought was unattainable. 1 year, 12 months, 365 days that had utterly transformed every aspect of our lives, not with a single seismic event, but with a series of small, intentional shifts and the quiet accumulation of daily choices. Our life was no longer a reaction to someone else's judgment. It had become a conscious expression of our own values. The loft had become our sanctuary. It wasn't just a space. It was a statement. Every piece of art on the walls, every book on the shelves, every piece of furniture we chose told a story of who we were. My studio, flooded with natural light, had become the epicenter of my creativity. I was no longer a solitary freelancer hustling for clients. My firm, Ellie Creative, had carved out a niche for itself. We specialized in branding for nonprofits and socially conscious startups. I had discovered that my passion wasn't just in design, but in helping people who were doing good in the world tell their stories effectively. The financial freedom had allowed me to take on projects that aligned with my conscience, not my bottom line. We'd hired 2 more young designers, raw, passionate talent, and mentoring them, watching them grow, had become one of my greatest joys. Leo, my husband, had undergone an even more profound transformation. He could have easily retired, lived a life of leisure, and never worked another day. But that wasn't Leo. For him, the sale of Nexus AI wasn't an endpoint. It was a launch pad. Leo Ventures had quickly become one of the most respected tech incubators in the city. He had an innate ability to see potential where others didn't, perhaps because he'd spent years being overlooked by men like my father. He didn't just write checks. He invested his time. I would often find him up late, brainstorming with a 2-year-old founder, sketching out ideas on a whiteboard, his excitement palpable. He was building an ecosystem of innovation, fueled by the belief that a good idea could come from anywhere. His legacy wasn't going to be a single algorithm, but the hundreds he helped nurture. Our wealth had changed our lives, but not in the ways my family might have predicted. We didn't join the country club. We didn't buy a yacht. Instead, we bought a small cabin in the woods, where we went on weekends to disconnect, hike with Pixel, and read by the fire. We traveled, not to 5-star resorts, but to places where we could experience different cultures. We trekked through Peru, explored temples in Kyoto, and volunteered at an animal sanctuary in Thailand. We were learning that true wealth wasn't in owning things, but in experiencing life as fully as possible. And the Ellie Creative Arts Fund had become the soul of our new life. We held our first scholarship showcase that spring. Seeing the faces of those talented high school students and their families, hearing them talk about how these scholarships were going to change their lives, was a humbling experience. One young woman, Maria, came up to me afterward with tears in her eyes. She said, "No one in my family ever believed someone like me could be a professional artist. Your fund didn't just give me money, it gave me permission to dream." Her words hit me deeper than any design award ever could. This was success. This was legacy. Meanwhile, the justice for my family unfolded not like a thunderstorm, but like a slow, inexorable erosion. They had built their castle on the sand of image and status, and when the tide of truth came in, the foundation began to dissolve. My parents' social world, the center of their universe, grew cold. The invitations to dinner parties dwindled. The phone calls became less frequent. People in their circle were masters at reading the currents of power, and my family had lost a great deal of it that night. The story of my father's speech had become a cautionary tale, a legend of hubris preceding a fall. My father, a man who had always prided himself on his control, was forced to confront the reality that he could no longer control his own narrative. His business suffered. In a world where reputation is everything, he had irreparably tarnished his own. But the real fallout was Clara's. She had been raised to believe the world was hers for the taking. Her success was preordained, guaranteed by her family's name and connections. When Richard called off the wedding, it wasn't just a personal rejection, it was the collapse of her entire worldview. He had chosen status over her, using the same ruthless logic our family had lived by against her. For the first time, she was on the losing side of a transaction. Without a lavish wedding to plan, without the merger of dynasties, she was left with a job she wasn't qualified for and an empty apartment. Aunt Agnes told me she had become withdrawn and bitter, blaming me for embarrassing the family and thus sabotaging her future. She couldn't see that it was the rotten foundation we were all built upon that had crumbled. We did make good on our promise to re-engage, but on our terms. The family therapy sessions had ended after those first 3. It was clear my parents were unwilling or unable to do the real work required for healing. But we did agree to see them on major holidays. Our first Thanksgiving together after the wedding was strange and strained. We met at a high-end restaurant, a neutral territory. The conversation was stilted, skimming across superficial topics. The weather, sports, Aunt Agnes's work. During the meal, my father made a clumsy attempt at an olive branch. "So, Leo," he said, "I hear you're doing very well with your investment firm. Perhaps you could show me your portfolio sometime." There he was, still trying to find an angle, a way to connect with us through the only lens he understood: money. Leo smiled politely. "Perhaps. But we're really focused on the founders right now, not the portfolio." The gentle but firm response shut that line of conversation down. The message was clear. We were not open for business. The most telling interaction came from my mother. As we were getting ready to leave, she pulled me aside. "Your loft? Is it nice?" she asked, her voice holding a note of genuine, almost wistful curiosity. "It's beautiful, Mom. It gets a lot of light," I replied. She nodded, looking away. "Clara's. She's not doing well. Her condo seems so dark." In that moment, I didn't see a manipulative matriarch, but a woman trapped between 2 daughters, realizing too late that she had backed the wrong horse, or perhaps that she shouldn't have been placing bets at all. I felt a flicker of pity, but not enough to break the boundaries I had fought so hard to build. Our relationship, I realized, would never be fixed in the traditional sense. It was irrevocably broken. But we had created something new, a kind of respectful armistice. An acknowledgement that we were family in name, but that we existed in separate emotional universes. And for me, that was enough. It was infinitely better than the toxic, false intimacy that had come before. Justice wasn't seeing them fail. Justice was me being free. Justice was being able to live a life unburdened by their judgment. Justice was seeing my own children, if we were lucky enough to have them one day, grow up in a home where they were loved for who they were, not what they achieved. Justice was breaking the cycle. 1 year later, when I looked back on my wedding night, I no longer felt the sharp sting of humiliation. I felt a strange sense of gratitude instead. Their cruelty had been an act of unintentional liberation. They had tried to cast me out of the family, but instead, they had pushed me into my own life. They had defined me as garbage, and in doing so, they gave me the chance to prove that I was a treasure, not to them, but to myself. and that was the only vindication that truly mattered. As I sit here today in my studio, the afternoon sun streams through the massive loft windows, casting long shadows across the floor where our rescue dog, Pixel, is sleeping. From this vantage point, I can see the entire city skyline, a sprawling tapestry of steel and glass, ambition and dreams. It's a view that never gets old. A year ago, I was living in a tiny apartment, making myself even smaller, trying to fit into a life that was never meant for me. It's funny how a single, terrible moment can become the catalyst for a lifetime of authentic joy. I often think about that journey, about the person I was versus the person I am now, and the painful lessons learned in between. For most of my life, I lived inside an invisible cage built from my parents' expectations. It wasn't a cage with bars. It was a cage of conditional love, of silent disappointment, of constant, exhausting comparison. I spent so much energy trying to be the person they wanted me to be, sanding down my own edges, muting my own colors, hoping that if I could just make myself a little less me, maybe they would finally offer the approval I so desperately craved. I was auditioning for the role of their daughter, a role I was never going to get because the part was written for my sister. My worth, I believed, was something external, something that had to be granted to me by them. And because they withheld it, I felt worthless. That's a heavy burden to carry. And it affects everything. It affects the chances you don't take, the words you don't say, the art you're afraid to create. You learn to shrink, to apologize for taking up space, to accept mistreatment as your due. You tell yourself, this is just how they are. Or worse, maybe they're right. Maybe I am the problem. My wedding night was the culmination of a lifetime of that dynamic. The speech my father gave, as cruel as it was the most honest he had ever been with me. And in a strange, painful way, it was a gift. That one word, garbage, was so brutal, so absolute, that it shattered the last remaining fragment of illusion I held on to. The illusion that if I just tried a little harder, was a little more successful on their terms, or married someone they approved of, that they would finally love me for me. His cruelty was the key that unlocked my cage. It was a terrible, violent sound, the sound of a lock breaking, but it set me free. In that moment of profound humiliation, I was liberated from the impossible task of ever trying to win their approval again. I didn't have to audition anymore. The show was over. And that's the first and most important lesson I learned. Your value is not a negotiation. It is not something that can be given or taken away by anyone, not by a parent, not by a sibling, not by a boss, and not by society. It is inherent. It is absolute. For years, I had been looking for my reflection in their eyes, and all I saw was disappointment. The moment I stopped looking, I was finally able to see myself clearly. I wasn't a failed version of my sister. I was the first and only version of me. And that person, the artist, the dreamer, the woman who chose love and passion over prestige, was not garbage. She was whole. The second lesson was about the nature of legacy. My father was obsessed with his legacy, a legacy of wealth, of a company with his name on it, of social standing. He saw his children as extensions of that legacy, vessels to carry his ambition forward. But what I've come to realize is that a legacy built on things is hollow. It has no soul. It's just a collection of assets. The true legacy, the one that Leo and I are trying to build, is a living one. It's not in the billion-dollar valuation. That was just the catalyst, the spark. The real legacy is in what we do with it. It's in the young woman from a low-income neighborhood who just started her first semester at art school on a full scholarship from our foundation, the first person in her family to go to college. It's in the two brilliant software engineers Leo is mentoring, whose world-changing idea might have died on the vine without the funding and support from his incubator. A true legacy isn't measured in what you accumulate. It's measured in the positive impact you have on the lives of others. My father built an empire for himself. We are trying to build a community for everyone. This brings me to the third lesson, which is about family. For so long, I was chained to the idea that blood is everything. You have to love your family. You have to forgive them. You have to show up for them, no matter what. But I've learned that is a dangerous oversimplification. Yes, family can be a source of incredible strength and love, but it can also be the source of our deepest wounds. The title of parent or sibling does not give someone a free pass to mistreat you, to demean you, or to harm your spirit. The process of detaching from them was a form of grief. I had to grieve the parents I wished I had, the family I saw in holiday movies, before I could accept the reality of the family I was actually given. And in that acceptance, I found the freedom to build my own. My family is Leo, whose belief in me never wavered, even when my own did. It's my Aunt Agnes who showed me what unconditional maternal love felt like. It's my maid of honor, Sarah, who would get on a plane at a moment's notice if I needed her. It's our circle of friends who celebrate our successes as their own. We call it our chosen family. A family bound not by obligation or DNA, but by mutual respect, genuine affection, and the shared choice to be in each other's lives. And finally, the most difficult and practical lesson was about boundaries and forgiveness. For a long time, I thought setting a boundary was an act of aggression. I felt guilty for saying no, for protecting my own peace. But what happened taught me that boundaries are not walls to keep people out. They are gates that you control. You get to decide who comes into your sacred space and on what terms. Our current relationship with my parents is built on these boundaries. It's not the warm, close relationship I once dreamed of, but it is honest, and it is safe. I can engage with them without sacrificing my own mental and emotional well-being. As for forgiveness, I've learned it's a complex and deeply personal process. Do I forgive my father for what he said? The act itself was, in my opinion, unforgivable. I will never forget the pain and humiliation of that moment. But I have chosen to forgive him for my own sake, not to absolve him, but to release myself from the anger and resentment that I carried for so long. Forgiveness, I've realized, isn't about saying, what you did was okay. It's about saying, what you did will no longer have power over me. It's the final act of taking my power back. My life today isn't perfect, but it is my own. It is a life built on the foundations of self-worth, a living legacy, a chosen family, and healthy boundaries. It is a life that feels authentic to its core. The irony is that by rejecting my parents' definition of success, I found a level of success and happiness that they, with all their money and status, may never truly understand. So, I want to ask you this. Have you ever had a breaking point in your life, a moment so painful or unjust, that it forced you to completely reevaluate everything? A moment that felt like an ending, but turned out to be the beginning of your most authentic self? What did you learn from that experience? And how did it change the course of your life? Please, share your stories in the comments below. Reading about each other's journeys is how we know we are not alone. If this story resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe for more real-life stories of resilience, and share this video with someone who might need to be reminded that their worth is not up for debate. Remember, sometimes the moment someone tries to define you as garbage is the very moment you discover the treasure you've been all along. Thank you for listening.